Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This panel is bringing together the two themes that we have seen in the last couple of days, which is innovation and today financing, and talking about innovative financing. So I'd like to welcome on stage my panelists on stage from different parts. We've got 3 people who are joining us in person and a couple who will join us virtually. So let me invite Dr. Amel Karboul to join us. She's the CEO of the Education Outcomes Fund. Thank you for joining us. We can have Mr. Thierry, who's the CEO of Credit Agricole Middle East and Africa. And last but not least, can we have Karutu, who's the Vice President of Programs at the End Fund. And joining us virtually from the US, we've got Justin Van Fleet, who's the President of Theirworld. Hopefully we have Justin on air. And we'll have Phyllis, Konstanza, who's the CEO of UBS Optimus Foundation. All right, thank you for being here. So clearly what we have heard this morning, we've had various plenaries where we've spoken of the challenges when it comes to financing education using traditional instruments. And we've seen that they're not sufficient. There's been calls for the gaps in financing are tremendous, and pressures are coming in from all sides. So we've seen the rise of private mechanisms, different tools, whether it's bonds, whether it's structures which employ multipliers. And on our panel today, we expect to discuss a whole range of instruments that are currently in play when it comes to innovative financing by those who are actually practitioners. So we'll begin with a discussion around, what is the landscape? And from there, we'll start understanding what are the learnings from that experience, because all of these, in a sense, could be considered, prototypes for helping scale out for a wider audience. We'll then, I guess, get into understanding what are the assumptions we need to interrogate when it comes to these innovative financing mechanisms before proceeding to discuss how can we learn from the edges? What other sectors can we learn from that have got similar, if not related, funding challenges? And last but not least, we'll kind of talk about the alternative pathways we can probably pursue. Our goal today is not to solve the $1 trillion of financing challenge that we keep hearing about, but to find an intelligent dialogue that we can build on our collective intelligence that has been in the last 2.5 days. So with that, let me, I guess, begin by inviting Dr. Amel. You've been involved with the Education Outcomes Fund since its inception. So I'd love to understand from you, when you look at your work, what are the mechanisms and tools in innovative financing that are currently in play, and what do you see their potential to be when it comes to kind of helping us deal with the challenge?
No, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here. I would like to start with a very short comment to say, let's demystify innovative finance. Over the last days, I've heard, impact bonds and outcomes funds and RBF and, CCTs and base subsidies and stuff. And it can scare people away in a way. And sometimes I even have someone called me like a few days ago. It's like, oh, can we do a debt swap in Ethiopia? And I was like, good morning. What's the problem? So in a way, we have to be, so I would say there are like 2 parts of innovative finance, if I can say so. There is tools that help you mobilize more finances, more resources, and there are tools that help us increase the effectiveness of public and donor funding. So the Education Outcomes Fund is more in the second categories, even if we hope by delivering more results, we will also raise more funding for education. So in its simplest form, what we're doing in outcomes funding is, as we heard over the last 2 days, 50% of the world children are failing to learn. The recent tell us 2/3 of all skills and TVET programs have absolutely no impact on employment. So basically, both in education and in youth employment, we are working with quite broken system. I say if you take a plane, an airline, that 50% of the time you land in a different country than you plan to go, how often will you use that airline? So it's a broken system. So what we're doing is, by shifting the payment, we pay for the results. We pay for a girl that moved from primary to secondary, stays 4 years. We pay for a young person, not for their training, but they are basically in a job and stay in that job for 6 months or a year. And by doing so, we put the whole system on its head. We create a new form of partnership. I hate the word PPP, kind of public-private partnership. But we kind of redesigning it, say it's partnership for public purpose, because the public purpose, delivering better for our citizen, is the goal. And so kind of we created the Outcomes Fund as a partnership between governments, donors, service providers, schools, etc., that actually gets paid once they deliver the result. And by putting the system on its head, there is a lot of other things that happen in the background that I can talk more about later.
Thank you, Karboul. So that, I think, sets the stage nicely for us to kind of, there's an outcomes focus that we just heard about. Thierry, in your work with the private sector, I guess, as well, in your role at the Crédit Agricole, what are the mechanisms that you're seeing when it comes to innovative financing, in the region, but also beyond?
So if I may, Crédit Agricole is a huge group, and we have the chance to be local and global. Meaning that what we develop on one side is the Grameen Crédit Agricole Foundation, particularly dedicated to microfinance in Africa. And those tools, microfinance, are dedicated to the local community, to the local farmers. It's a kind, what I like to call it, the inverted pyramid, where you pay attention to the local people and the local farmers, you give them the means to develop. And if I take this example of La Laitière in Senegal, where we developed the milk production for the farmers, we gave a job to thousands of local farmers. We developed the local production. Now they are exporters of milk. But it took 10 years to make it profitable. And we did it through the funding support, the microfinance techniques, but we did it also with the skills of our people, our staff. They are used to be close to the farmers, and they go to Africa, and they go locally to train the people. So this is one side of Crédit Agricole. And what is interesting and far more challenging is the other side, the Crédit Agricole Corporate Investment Banking, the investment banking arm of Crédit Agricole. We were, in 2011, one of the founders of the green bond concept. And we have been a leader in developing environmental linked financial tools. But now we need to go one step further. And this is where we can work together is, as you mentioned social impact bonds, but I would like to mention social. The new concept, the new traction, and we can come back to it in a few minutes, is ESG framework, and I would be very happy to elaborate on this.
Thank you, Thierry. So I think that also provides a nice segue. Carol, your work is not in the world of education per se. You're, I guess, in those edges, but it'd be great to get a sense on, when you work in healthcare, what have you been seeing as well that are innovative financing mechanisms as a highlight before we get into the details later on?
Thank you very much. Yes, I work in health and not in education, but there's a lot of intersections between health and education, specifically for the work that we do at the End Fund, which is working on 5 most common neglected tropical diseases. The platform of delivery is actually schools. Just last year, in 2019, we dewormed over 80 million children through the school platform. When COVID hit last year, for example, our work was heavily impacted because the schools were closed, as you might know. And when we talk about innovative financing, and what we did learn just in that period of last year is the communities where the children come from, the communities where our teachers live, how can we support or better support these communities to offer both education at home, but also to support deworming, for example, which is one area that we work in. The second part is the fact that donor funding really is becoming scarcer, and it's something we are noticing in the health field. So what do we do? How do we get, I'll speak specifically for the work that we do, mostly in the African continent. 90% of the funding is from international communities. So the question we are asking ourselves right now, how do we get, for example, the African diaspora that remits about $42 billion every year to the African continent to contribute to elimination of neglected tropical diseases. I think that's a really good model that we can use even in the education sector to see how the diaspora remittances could be used to support education.
Thank you, Carol. I'd like to go, I guess, virtually right now to have, Phyllis Konstanza join us. She's been working with a lot of these organizations with the UBS Optimus. Phyllis, hopefully you can hear us and give us a sense of what you've been seeing when it comes to innovative financing in the world of education and beyond.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I only wish I could be there in person. So I'm sure what you've been hearing these past few days is how critical this timing is. And, the pandemic has been exacerbating previous inequalities. And we know that learning outcomes, children will experience probably a 3-year learning loss based on estimates from the World Bank. So we need to find innovative solutions. And it's not just getting more money to these programs, but it's also improving outcomes. And we need to focus on developing the types of skills that children are going to need in order to secure jobs in the future. And so that's in information technology, it's in the green economy, and the private sector has a really critical role to play. And what we're seeing is a huge interest in results-based financing. We're in a very unique position. So UBS Optimus Foundation is actually a service for our clients. It's not our corporate philanthropy. That's another group, but the Optimus Foundation helps to develop ways that our clients can give, particularly in resource-poor settings, because we know that less than 13% of all philanthropy goes to low and middle income countries. Most philanthropy stays in the home country, and it's usually in northern countries. So we're trying to encourage our companies to give in the global south, and we're finding that by doing this through results-based financing mechanisms, it is much more interesting for our clients. We've launched a number of development impact bonds. We did the first one in education in India with Educate Girls. That one was extremely successful. And then we have since gone on to launch several others. One of them, what we did in our second one is actually, instead of just working with one implementing partner like Educate Girls, we're working with 4 implementing partners. And so this helps to diversify risk. And what we're seeing in the innovative finance space, particularly in the results-based financing space, is that we're coming up with ways to de-risk these tools even more by diversifying, as I mentioned, the number of implementing partners and working with them in advance to make sure that they have performance management systems in place, which are critical for these types of instruments, so that these organizations working on the ground can know in real time whether or not the children are learning. And now more than ever, it's really critical because we're not going to be counting, bums in seats anymore. We're not getting that. We have to teach children in a really different way. And all that matters right now is whether or not these kids are learning. And results-based financing, I think, is one of the best ways to help finance that outcome and deliver on it at scale.
Thank you, Phyllis. I mean, you brought up a very important point of working with more than one just partner when it comes to building together coalitions for your second bond. So I want to have Justin Van Fleet join us, because obviously he represents the Global Business Coalition for Education, where they have to work with multiple partners. So Justin, I guess very early, good morning, and would love to get your sense on what you've been seeing when it comes to innovative financing, and what have been the, I guess, learnings so far in this entire journey.
Great, thank you so much, Amel. It's great to be here. For me, I think it's really helpful to zoom out and look a bit at the broader context of what the challenges in terms of financing we're trying to solve first. We know that by 2030, we'll need about $3 trillion annually to go into education systems in low and middle income countries. We know that domestic finance will be the bulk of that resource that will be mobilized, We need to hit the targets of about 20% of budgets, which comes to about 4 to 6% of GDP being invested into education systems. We then know that international aid, philanthropy also has a role to play. Currently, aid is about $16 billion, I think in 2019 when it hit a peak, projected to fall because of the pandemic. And we've recently calculated that we'll need a minimum of $75 billion in external resources if we're to try to bridge this gap and come within striking distance of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, and that's if we're using the money effectively. It goes to some of the points that our other colleagues have made. It's not just money, it's how we're using money. And I go back to the Education Commission report that looked at how do we mobilize these sums of finance for the SDGs. And their proposal of the International Finance Facility for Education, I still think is one of the more promising models for how we can leverage the sums needed if we're really trying to reach this $75 billion target. It uses a combination of sovereign donor guarantees, leveraging some of the existing multilateral development banks, including the World Bank and regional banks, to create accessible concessional finance for countries. And I think what's interesting about this model, bringing together public and private partners, you can actually have a leverage factor of 27 to 1 because of the way it uses the guarantees through AAA rated MDBs. So if we look at what that means in reality, you could take $6.25 billion of aid and create $50 billion in new resources. And again, if we can get that money flowing to investments that make sense and that work and yield results, we get much closer to the size of numbers that we need to be seeing to be able to reach any of these goals that we've set out for ourselves.
Thank you, Justin. I think just shifting, Amel, you've been trying to, I guess, prototype a new approach with a focus on outcomes. So I'd love to understand, what have your learnings been from this journey that I guess, are we dealing as, going back to the point that Justin made, it's requiring us to challenge what are the challenges we are solving for as well. So, what's the challenge that we are working with that you've been seeing in your experience as well?
So look, when we started this, it's not working. When we started this, almost now 4 years ago, I was thinking if I go to governments and philanthropists and tell them the money you spend will be 100% for our results. And if the outcomes are not achieved, you're not going to spend. I thought they're going to be queuing from here to Abu Dhabi, to kind of be working with us. And I know Phyllis is here, and she told me once a statistic that I think 80% of their high net wealth individuals do philanthropy, but only 20% are happy with the impact. So basically, we are filling a massive gap here. But I think that the biggest challenge is a mindset change, because governments and donors don't spend for outcomes, don't spend for results, they spend budgets. So I give you an example. Let's say you have and if you don't spend your budget, you don't get it the next year again, And let's say you're in October and you have still travel budget left, and that's why there are a lot of conferences, I think, in November and December, because everyone tried to spend their travel budget. But imagine you had the flexibility not to spend it on travel, but to reach more children. But you don't have that today. And it's really crazy because I worked in the private sector 17 years. I was minister in government and now in this sector, and I still find certain things crazy that we have this show me the receipt mentality. We're holding people accountable for activities. How many children have been through a workshop, or how many teachers, or how many community, but we are not asking the right question is, are children learning, are young people employed? And so the mindset shift, which we're working on and which we're really happy, we have FCDO supporting us now, the SECO Swiss government, the government of Ghana, of Sierra Leone, etc. So is happening to say, how can I deliver better for my citizen? How can I actually hold people accountable for results and not activities? And once you do that mindset shift, let's assume that's happened, which is still kind of a minority today, then the question is, can you do it? And there comes the process problem. Governments and most multilateral today cannot buy outcomes. If you can't, I know it sounds boring, the procurement, no one likes that, but the devil is in the detail. If you can't buy something, you can't do it. Governments today can buy services, like consulting, or they can buy goods, but they can't buy outcomes. And so I have to really thank our partner, UNICEF, their legal team, wherever you are in the ether, thank you very much. For 18 months, we worked with the UNICEF legal team, with 2 big law firms. Freshfield has been supporting us amazingly. And now I can say the Education Outcomes Fund with the UN, with UNICEF, we are the first big multilateral that can buy outcomes. We have the legal paper, we have the procurement paper, we have the procurement process, and please don't replicate this. We give you this for free. It's public knowledge out there. We're working with the World Bank in Ghana now to achieve exactly that the World Bank also can't buy outcomes, by the way, yet, so that they have that. And so once the mindset shift, we need to have also the how in place to be able to do it. So these are kind of some of the challenges. Already 100 others, I would speak for another hour, but I wanted to focus on these.
Well, I mean, you bring up a great point, which is that, it's not just the funding problem. We actually have got structural issues, in whether it's procurement, incentive structures, etc. So, Thierry, I'd love to get your sense, because obviously you are potentially the funder and also on the other side as well. Is it really a funding problem that we are dealing with, or is it an allocation problem? I mean, what sort of issue is it that you've seen in your experience at Credit Agricole?
I'm sure, being in the private sector, you will not be surprised that the ultimate issue is profitability. If I go back to where we have been successful, particularly in microfinance in Africa, as I mentioned, there are 2 key issues. One is to be local. To be local, if you translate to education, I mean it's looking after the learner, not always the learning. So how can we be more relevant to the learner? How can we involve the learner? And then the second issue is how can we make it profitable? Because I'm sorry to tell that if it's not profitable, it's going to be really tough to attract private funding, international funding. And I would say in a way that what happened during COVID is a kind of opportunity, because it's opening the eyes that we have to find profitable way, a sustainable model to do it. So these are the lessons we draw from what we have been doing, local, profitable. Now how can we duplicate to education? That's the challenge. How can be relevant to the learner, how we can make it profitable. And what I can drop on the table today is why not combining school and feeding, school feeding. We know how to make it profitable from the farmers' approach. Now we know that food is essential, and I refer to the previous panel. You're absolutely right. If you are not properly fed, you will not be able to school, you will not be allowed to go to school. So how can we make the connection of the two to be able to duplicate this kind of business model?
I mean, that's a great point. The connectivity that's there between not just education in education, but education to nutrition, education to, say, the actual air quality that we breathe. And I suppose, Carol, as you've been, I guess, been involved in, funding programs or receiving the grants to fund programs, what are the learnings from that universe that you feel we need to keep in mind to help us deal with this enormous challenge when it comes to education financing?
Thank you. Before I get to your question, I'd just like to add that there's another connectivity between what Thierry said, and that's in health. So with there's health, there's nutrition, there's education, and the list continues. But to answer your question, I'll just give 2 examples. And the first example that I'll give is the NFund's funding model. So the NFund has created 3 funds within itself, and each of these funds looks at different technical areas. As I mentioned earlier, we work on neglected tropical diseases, and 5 of them. And these diseases don't all occur in the same geography. So one of the funds is specifically looking at elimination of 2 diseases that in 7 countries, while the other fund is looking very specifically at innovation that supports deworming, a lot of which is delivered actually through the school platform. While the third fund looks at reaching countries or reaching individuals in countries that others are not supporting. These are countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, where there is, in most times, war, or countries where donors are not very attracted to. So that's a really interesting model because it's not it's technical area specific, interest area specific, but also government specific. And donors and or investors are attracted by different things. So having that multiple areas that they can consider is a very important model. The next example that I'd like to share is from my past work in Kenya, where a partnership of stakeholders that included the US government, an international NGO, state actors, in this case, the Higher Education Loans Board, and private sector. And in many African countries, including my own, Kenya, 70% of health services are provided by mid-level health workforce, not your doctor. It is really the mid-level nurse, the mid-level clinical officer that mans many of the health facilities that you see. While the government of Kenya, for years, has been providing loans for degree programs, they never provided loans for people that were looking to train at the mid-level. And so we saw this particular gap and came in and formed a loan fund. And at the point of design and inception, we actually thought that this loan fund would be mostly be supported by the private sector. But to our surprise, when we brought it into the Higher Education Loans Board, which is a government entity, they very quickly saw the opportunity because the mid-level training takes 3 years, then they give you 1 year of grace period not to pay your loan. So it's 4 years and you start paying your loan. While the degree programs take 4 years, 1 year grace period, so 5 years to start receiving their returns. Also in terms of employment, the mid-level trainees, 70% of them get employed within 12 months of training. Well, for a degree program, 30% will get employment in the first year. So in terms of payback, the mid-level health workforce was able to pay back their loans at a very fast rate. And today, as I speak, the Higher Education Loans Board in Kenya actually we were able to transition this program, so they fully supported and fully funded and have actually expanded to other TVET programs. So not only was it by just recognizing who provides the services, what are the training opportunities, we were able to create a very skilled workforce and continue to do that, but it's also sustainable because right now it's 100% funded and supported by the government of Kenya.
Thank you, Carol. So, Phyllis, what would be interesting to understand from that perspective, we see that education has many more constraints to face vis-a-vis the healthcare sector. So, these include things like, measurement, recurrent costs, and the uncertainty that comes in investing in education. So, in your experience, how can we overcome these constraints vis-a-vis education that perhaps the healthcare sector has got a slightly more easier ride, though I would not say it's easy?
Yes, well, we have definitely done a lot more work on the healthcare side when it comes to innovative financing and measuring outcomes than we have done on the education side. And in fact, after this call, I'm going into the office and I have a meeting with a client who is a billionaire. He doesn't give a lot of money away. And so my job is to get him to give his money away. And the reason he said he doesn't is because he doesn't trust philanthropy. Now, we can all roll our eyes at that and talk eloquently about the important role that philanthropy has to play in this. But what I need to demonstrate to this person is that we can do things with knowledge of outcomes where we're de-risking the, quote, philanthropic investment. However, philanthropy is by nature risk capital. That's what it's about. And so we really do need to balance the need to understand the outcomes also with the desire to test new things. But one way that I think we could improve our knowledge of outcome, and Amel talked a little bit about this, is, I dream about one day having a platform where people can come together and we've got implementers, we've got investors, and we have outcome funders, and all together on one platform, powered by technology like blockchain, whereby you can play whatever role you want. If you're implementing a program and you know what your cost is to deliver learning outcomes, somebody could invest in that. And then you've got an outcome funder who only wants to pay if it works. And they can go on this platform and buy the outcomes. And so there should be at least a role for everybody in this philanthropic or investment space, from those who want to take substantial risks, so those are the investors in this case, and those that simply want to buy outcomes. They want to know for certain that their money is making an impact. And with that, we need knowledge of impact. Right now, we're testing the use of blockchain to validate outcomes specifically around education. And so once we're done with that experiment, I'll report back, hopefully in person next time, on the outcomes of that. But that is one way to use technology to provide different solutions and financing approaches for different risk appetites.
Phyllis, you're, I think, teed up maybe Justin very well for the next one when you said we need to actually build a platform that brings these different stakeholders together under, whether it's a blockchain-enabled sort of under a system. Justin, you've been working at the Global Business Coalition for Education. I mean, how can we ensure that to get this complementary and I guess collaborative approach in education financing going, that we can speak better to each other and leverage each other's strengths so that we can actually create a bigger outcome than like the sum of our parts is bigger than the individual ones?
That's a great question, because I think the worst case scenario is we end up having an impact that's less than the sum of all of our parts, which sometimes I think we run the risk of with so many different initiatives out there and lack of understanding around what's happening in the space. So we put together at Theirworld the education finance playbook earlier this year, where we actually tried to map out who the actors are and how the system currently exists for financing education, looking at some of the major funds that mobilize over $100 million a year that are dedicated to education, looking at the existing international institutions, so the World Bank, the regional banks, UNICEF, UNRWA, and how all of those funds work together, and the pathways for where the funding flows. So when we start to think about innovative finance, new mechanisms, it's a really great tool for identifying where it can plug in to some of the existing systems. The other thing that we did in that report is we looked at the issue of where money is being invested. And so we tried to pull out some of the latest research on the interventions and the investments that are showing results. So everything from school feeding to the digital wave with Giga and those types of initiatives, and also looking at issues of refugee education. So I think the first is understanding the landscape and what's out there. Is the first thing that we need to be doing before we can even start to talk to one another and learn a bit about how we can leverage the various resources and the value adds that everyone brings to the table. I think one thing we need to be committed to is making the existing system work better. And it goes back to some of these issues that Amel and others are raising about results and making sure that funding is going to the right place in the most efficient way possible. I think there's a lot of waste out there. And I also think that there's a lack of priority of education. If institutions like the World Bank can set a climate goal, they can obviously set an education target as well, which we've been calling for the 15%. And then we have to commit to actually looking at the reality of the situation and innovating in education. There's this hesitancy, and I have never quite understood. I mean, we have IFM and Gavi that has been around forever in the health sector. The climate meetings the other week in Scotland, they're actually taking a blueprint that we did with the finance facility to apply to climate. And so I think education really needs to get on the front end of wanting to take some of these risks and new ways of looking at how to solve this challenge.
Thank you, Justin. Thierry, I guess I have a similar question for you as well. You know, as a banker, you work with multiple stakeholders. How do you kind of help create this sort of ecosystem, this platform where we can leverage each other's strengths to contribute to a cause which I guess needs alignment, but no motivation, hopefully?
I think, again, we believe a lot bringing the local and the global together. I mean bringing the learner and the learning together, bringing a top-down approach, which is mostly the approach that we are looking at today, to a more local approach, to combine, as I said, as suggested, the food and the learning, and in order to reach something that we are missing today, is a social impact certification. And I think if there is something we need to do in order to make sure that long-term we can attract new funding, new capital, we need the same way it has been done for green bonds, for example, we need a social impact certification. It's tricky. It's not easy for education because, and also we don't like to speak about profitability with education usually. But ultimately, we have to find a way to do it. We have to work together, all stakeholders, to see how can we define a social impact certification. The day we do it, we can we can launch social impact bonds, we can launch social impact funds. It can be closed-end funds. It will be possible to have open-ended funds, but we need a social impact certification, and this is where all parties have to come together. Some works have already been done, and congratulations to the World Food Programme, to all the initiatives that has been taken. Now we should sit on the table and see how we can make it happen.
All right, so in the interest of time, we'll do a quick rapid fire with all of you. I'm going to give you no more than 10 seconds. After that, please cut off their mics after that. So this is going to be a quick fire. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I'll begin with Amel, which is, when you look at the education financing ecosystem, who should we bring into this process, individual or organization, to help accelerate the rewiring of education? Your 10 seconds has started.
Oh my God. I do believe we need to work more with the financial institutions like yours and others. In education, we really don't have we don't have that acumen. We don't know that actually with very smart financial engineering, you can take $1 million and leverage it to 40 million. We don't know how to do that. And there are models out there. But we speak such different languages. When I started doing this 4 years ago, to be honest, I didn't know even what an asset class is, Now I can use all the jargon. But that's actually my hope, and I see more of that collaboration happening in New York. We speak with really big funds, and sometimes I sat with an asset manager. They were managing like $3 trillion, and I was like, why are you talking with me? Actually, I'm tiny, and we're doing so little. And they said, no, we believe you are the future. How we're going to have actually not only financial returns, but also social return, how money and capital will not just kind of create profit and dump all externalities on society that the governments have then to deal with, but how we can together change society. And those conversations that are happening today, they didn't happen 4 years ago. That gives me hope.
Thank you. You've answered all my 3 questions, so we'll... All right, Thierry, we'll go with you. Thank you.
I think we have a unique opportunity. The unique opportunity is that during the last 10 years, we spoke about environmental issues. Today, as we speak, it's ESG, and the big S. Today, we advise governments, we advise sovereign wealth funds, and particularly in the Middle East, from UAE to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to Oman, to Egypt. You have to come with an ESG framework. And in the framework, the most challenging part is S, social. So we have a unique opportunity because all governments, all firms around the world, all banks will have to come with an ESG framework, and how can we improve the S of ESG? And this is where we can fit, and let's go for it because there is traction. There is traction today that did not exist 10 years ago.
Thank you. Kara, very quickly to you, we're almost out of time.
Yeah, mine is a challenge that we should all look across sectors, across different stakeholders, because truly that's where the opportunities lay. And look beyond just your sector, but look at the person. If it's the child, results-based financing in my area will mostly focus on maternal outcomes. And I forget that that child is born. So what happens thereafter? You're talking about school. So that same child, how do we have a model that starts at that point where that looks at maternal outcomes and carries on to education as just one particular continued platform?
All right, other sectors. Phyllis, over to you.
Great. I'm going to answer your question about hope. What gives me hope? And the silver lining, if we can say there is one, to this horrific pandemic is that people understand that the inequalities have gotten so much worse. And I am seeing more so than ever in my many decades career in this space, the interest of wealthy individuals to step up and give in places where it really matters. And so that is, I hope we can end on a positive note, but that's an optimistic view that I'm seeing across the board from our clients globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. And Justin, you have the final word.
I think you asked, who do we need to bring in to be part of this? And I think it's about bringing in people that want to work smarter, want to work harder for children. And I think it's about having open minds and an innovative spirit. And if we bring that together with the folks already working on this issue, we can truly make an impact.
Thank you, Justin, Phyllis, Dr. Amel, Thierry, and Carol for a wonderful conversation. We've not solved the challenge of education, but we've left with a message of hope. And hopefully this continues for the rest of the conference. Thank you all for joining us for this panel.
MC.